I am so delighted to introduce to you this morning Dr. Miranda Cruz. You may know Miranda because her other half, Jonathan, has been leading our praise. But Miranda is an incredible Christian woman in her own right. She is a lifelong United Methodist, grew up in Colorado. Then went to undergrad, I think in Washington State, wasn't it? And then she went to seminary at Princeton University, so she got her sampling in Presbyterianism in those years. Then she and Jonathan, she went on to matriculate at Baylor in Texas, and that's where she and Jonathan met, where she pursued her PhD, and she is a doctor. She has her PhD in church history, right? Is that right? Kind of, you'll say it different. I probably didn't get it exactly right. But she comes to us as a person of great faith. She's on faculty at Indiana Wesleyan, where she's an assistant professor, teaching church history and some other great things. And she also, just in the last few months, has discerned a call to ministry. So just at our congregation's leadership team meeting just a month ago, we affirmed Miranda as a candidate for ordained ministry, which means in addition to being a professor, she will also have credentials as a United Methodist clergy person. So she's begun that long and arduous process, almost as long, Miranda. I got bad news. It takes as long as it does to get a PhD to get accepted as a Methodist clergy. But that's just the way it is. But she comes with a real heart and passion, and I know you're going to appreciate what she has to say, and I'm just so privileged that she has the opportunity to come and share. Would you welcome Miranda as she comes? Thank you.
Good morning. I've been told that if we stand out there, we can't be seen in the back, so I'm going to be up here. Is there any better way to start the new year than with the gospel? That's what a privilege and what a blessing it is when we can have a new year on a Sunday morning together. Would you pray with me? Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Have I ever told any of you that I trained to be an Olympic gymnast? It's true. Now, my coaches and my parents, they didn't know that that's what was happening. But I was certain that my destiny in life was the Olympics, probably around 1996 or so. Now, I had it all worked out. I lived in Colorado, but I could go live with my granny in Oklahoma City, and I could train at the same gym where gold medalist Shannon Miller trained. It would be perfect. It would be amazing. I would focus on the floor exercise because the vault and the beams and the bars completely freaked me out. But at the floor exercise, I would be perfection. My coaches just needed to realize it was only a matter of time before they knew that they had the next Nadia Comaneci on their hands. Now, when people would say, maybe you're going to end up being a little bit too tall to be a professional gymnast, I would remind them that Svetlana Boginskaya from Belarus was 5'8". So, it's possible. Anything is possible. Now, kids love to dream big, right? Kids' visions and imaginations for themselves aren't limited by little things like reality or natural limitations or a complete lack of athletic skill or talent, in my case. I love to hear what kids want to be when they grow up because their ideas are such an interesting mix of things they've seen in the real world, things they've read in stories. I asked some of my friends what they or their kids had wanted to be when they were little. Some of the answers I got were things you might expect: teachers, nurses, doctors, policemen, these heroic jobs that children dream of having. Some of them were a little more ambitious. They want to be actors or singers or dancers. And then there were the ones who were really creative. One wanted to be a marching band not in a marching band or a marching band conductor, but the whole marching band. I would love to see that. One wanted to be a princess / doctor / ice cream maker. So I can see those could go together pretty well. One of our very own members wanted to be a singing policeman. Another of our very own members wanted to be a roof worker. Someone wanted to be a garbage man. Now, these are all fun things to imagine, but at some point, as we grow up, maybe in high school or college, we start asking a bigger question. What kind of person am I becoming? Am I kind? Am I generous? Do I have integrity? And then an even bigger question, what does God want me to do with my life? Now this question, what is God's purpose for me? There's dozens of books written about it. There's college classes on it. There's online surveys you can take to help you discover God's will for your life. And a lot of those things can be really helpful. But they tend to limit God's purpose for us to a specific career path, or the things we're going to spend our days doing, or maybe something a little loftier like moral character. But the thing is that God's purpose for our life is not limited by those things. We tend to think of God's purpose as some kind of mystery that we have to solve, or a puzzle that we need to figure out how to decipher. To pick out the clues out of the Bible and out of our history and figure out what is that one right path. And if we miss that path, then, well, too bad. I guess our life was wasted. But the thing is, God's purpose for us runs so much deeper than just what we spend our days doing. God's purpose for us is about who we are in our nature. And it's not a mystery. God's not trying to be sneaky and hide it from us. God actually reveals God's purpose for us at Christmas. We're still in the Christmas season. Did you know Christmas Day is just the first day of the Christmas season? We're sitting with this time period in the church where we celebrate and think about what God has done for us by becoming flesh. And one of the most important things that God has done for us is revealed in the flesh what his purpose for each of us is. You see, God comes to us as a human, takes on human nature, but doesn't cease to be God. And in doing that, he reveals that our purpose is not some abstract or lofty thing, but it's actually concrete. Our purpose is to become like Christ. Now, Paul puts it this way in Romans 8. If you want to use your own Bible or a pew Bible or an app on your phone, we're in Romans 8, 28 through 30 this morning. I'm sorry, we don't have it on the screen. Paul says this: "We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn within a large family. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified." So what Paul tells us here is that God's purpose for us, the purpose to which we are called, is much bigger than our career or our moral character. God's purpose for us is nothing less than a complete transformation to be conformed to the image of Christ, and then to be adopted into the household of God. What we are becoming is daughters and sons in a household, the large family with Jesus Christ as the firstborn son. So the first part of this text is familiar to us. Paul says all things work together for good. We've all heard that before. It's on greeting cards, it's on pieces of art. It's something we tell ourselves or others when we experience some kind of tragedy or setback. But these simple words are not just a trite saying we throw around to make ourselves feel better. They're not a cliche. They're a profound promise. These words tell us that whatever else may be happening, God is at work, and God's work will ultimately be good. Julian of Norwich clung to this promise from God. She was a 14th century Christian woman, and during her lifetime, the plague was ravaging all of Europe. Tens of thousands of people died in the period of just a few short years. Historians believe that her own family died of the plague, and she nearly died at least once. And in this troubled circumstance, on top of all of that, she was deeply distressed by the sin that she saw in her own heart and the sin that she saw in the world around her. And she asked God, why? What is going on here? What are you doing? The answer that she received, she wrote down in her book, Revelations of Divine Love, which also happens to be the first known book in the English language written by a woman. The answer that she received from God was, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. In that circumstance, as her family is dying, as she's watching this destruction wrought by the plague, when she says, all shall be well, she's not diminishing the severity of the circumstances. She's not putting blinders on and saying, oh, well, everything's actually fine. She's not pretending that there aren't actually terrible things happening. What she's doing is clinging to that same promise that Paul said, that God is at work and ultimately everything shall be well. That God really is working everything together for good. When Paul says that, he's not saying that everything that happens is good. He's not saying that everything that happens in the world is caused by God. He's not saying that things that seem bad, we just aren't seeing clearly and they're actually good. He's saying that whatever is happening, whatever our circumstances are, whatever is going on in the world, there is no force or event or person so powerful that it can derail God's purpose for each of us and for the world. That's a word, that's a promise that we learn to trust in and cling to despite our circumstances. Our careers may change, our health may improve or decline, our family structures may shift, but none of that has any effect on God's ultimate purpose for us or on God's ability to fulfill that purpose. So what is that purpose then? What is this purpose toward which all things work together for good? Paul tells us in the next verse, to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that we might be the firstborn within a large family. That's a purpose we couldn't have come up with on our own. When we dream about what we want to be when we grow up, we wouldn't have imagined that what we are called to be is conformed to the image of Christ. That's too big for us. We can't fathom that. The only reason we have any idea what that even means is because of the incarnation, because God comes to us as a human child and lives a human life. And we have this word conformity, be conformed. We don't like that word. We try to avoid the word conformity. To conform is to imitate, to toe the line, to kowtow. We don't like those things. Conformity doesn't have a good connotation in our culture. What we celebrate is people who don't conform, who are nonconformists, who stand out, who throw off the bounds of convention and strike out on their own path and do their own thing. And that's all well and good. I think of some of the ways that our culture celebrates this breaking free from conformity. There's a perfume commercial where you have a ballroom. It's full of people that are dressed in black evening wear. They have these shimmering strings attached to their arms like puppets. And the voiceover says, "In a world of dictates and conventions, could there be another way?" As Julia Roberts breaks off her little puppet strings and ascends a staircase in her white dress as the other puppets watch in awe. She breaks away from her puppet strings. Now, I don't know what that has to do with perfume, but it appeals to the rebel in us, right? We want to be our own person. We want to swim upstream. We don't want to be like everyone else. We are encouraged to blaze our own trail. Somehow in high school, we're simultaneously terrified of not being unique and not fitting in. This is why teenagers are under so much stress, right? Which way are you supposed to go? Are you supposed to be like everybody else? Or are you supposed to be completely unlike anyone else? What are we supposed to do? But the truth of the matter is that no matter how unique or original or creative we are, no matter how much we actually succeed in blazing our own trail, we're still conforming. We conform to American ideals about what life is supposed to be like. We conform to the people around us. We become similar to the people we spend the most time with. We conform to the idea that not conforming is good. And more than any of that, we conform to our nature. We conform to the pattern of sin that's part of what it means to be human, something we can't overcome. We have a natural inclination, we have a natural instinct to be self-seeking, to be proud, to value our own desires over the desires of God or of other people, to love ourselves more than we love the people around us. And however much we can try to not conform, we're conformed to that. That's in our nature. Now, it wasn't always that way. We were created good. People were created in the image of God, male and female, and God said it was very good. But people chose their own desires over the desires of God, and ruptures were created. Our relationship with God was broken. Our relationships with each other were broken. Sinfulness corrupted human nature, and now our natural inclination is towards sinfulness. It's not a popular idea. We don't like to think about ourselves naturally being drawn to selfishness or pride. But if you've ever spent more than a few minutes with more than 2 children, you know that this is true. If 2 children walk into a playroom full of toys, one of them starts playing with something. It doesn't matter what that something is. That something could be a dirty old shoe, and what's that other kid going to do? They want that shoe. They don't want any of the shiny new Christmas presents that are around the room. They want what the other person has, this natural inclination to selfishness. We have to teach children to be kind and to be empathetic, to be compassionate, to be loving. We don't have to teach them to be selfish. That comes perfectly naturally. Any mother knows that if you make a meal for your child, it doesn't matter what that is. It doesn't matter if the kid asked you to make that specific meal. Once you sit down with food that you wanted for yourself, now the kid wants what's on your plate, right? This is just our natural inclination. This corruption that's within our nature is something that we don't have the power to fix ourselves. It's much deeper than a problem of having good or bad habits. It's a problem that's beyond human repair. We see this in the whole history of Israel. The whole Old Testament is basically the story of people who are told how to follow God, how to have a close relationship with God, who do that for a little while, then fall away, then get themselves in big trouble, rediscover God, worship God for a little while, and repeat the cycle over and over again. The problem isn't the need for a new law or a new instruction book for how to behave. The only solution is to receive a new human nature. It's a much deeper solution than just fixing our behavior. This is what God gives us at Christmas. God comes to us fully human, fully divine, and gives us a way out of our conformity to sin. We now have the option of joining a new family, being conformed to the image of Christ, having a transformed nature, so that we aren't bound by this conformity to sin. Instead, we can choose to be bound to conformity to the image of Christ. So what is this image of Christ then? If we're supposed to be conformed to this image, what does that actually mean? Well, a couple things it's not. First of all, it doesn't mean that we're somehow elevated to the status of being divine. We're not becoming gods, okay? There's only one God, and none of you or me or it. So it's not that. It also doesn't mean becoming really good at following a list of Christian rules. I think this is one of the biggest mistakes that Christians make. We reduce following Christ to a long list of do's and don'ts. We reduce it to behavior. We reduce it to morality. We create a checklist for ourselves and others of all the things we have to do or not do to be a good Christian, and then we judge ourselves and we judge others on the basis of this checklist that often has very little to do with what the Bible actually says about following Christ. Being conformed to the image of Christ runs deeper than our behavior. Our behavior reveals what our nature is, but what we're doing when we're following Christ is being transformed from the inside. I can do a lot to change my behavior. I can develop better habits. I can get into the habit of being kind or being generous, but only God can transform my heart and make me an actually more generous, kind, loving person. So what is the image of Christ then? Well, to understand what the image of Christ is, we look at who Christ is revealed to be in Scripture. First, Jesus was without sin. The author of the letter to the Hebrews says, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, but without sin." To be conformed to the image of Christ means that sin loses its power over us. It doesn't mean that we get really good at making good choices. It means that our hearts are actually transformed so that we don't have a natural inclination to sin anymore. Sin, selfishness, pride, self-seeking, these things actually become unnatural to us as we're conformed to the image of a sinless Christ. Second, Jesus understood and followed the will of God the Father. Jesus taught his disciples to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." As Jesus prepared for his death, he prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." As we're conformed to the image of Christ, we learn to trust that God's will for us is better than anything we could have come up with on our own. And we get better at discerning what that will is and willingly following that will. Corrie ten Boom said, "The safest place to be is the center of God's will." Corrie ten Boom was a Dutch Christian. She lived in the Netherlands during World War II. Her family was responsible for saving over 800 Jews from the Nazis. And then she and her entire family were arrested in 1944. Her father and sister died in concentration camps. So when Corrie ten Boom says the safest place to be is the center of God's will, she's not talking about physical safety. She's not talking about earthly comfort. She's talking about a deep and abiding faith that the will of God is so much better than following our own will. Following God's will may lead us into uncomfortable places. It may lead us into places that even seem dangerous to us. And nevertheless, we trust that the safest place we can be is following the will of God. It's easy for us to displace God's will with our will, especially when our will seems to be working out for us pretty well. Why, if I am blessed, if I have a good life, doesn't that mean that I must be following God's will? Maybe, maybe not. Following God's will may lead you to make a change. It may lead you to change jobs. It may lead you to move. It may lead you into uncomfortable and dangerous places. It may lead you to loving your family more deeply and doing your job with more integrity right where you are. But you only know if you're being conformed to the image of Christ and able to discern and follow the will of God. The third thing that we know about the image of Christ is that Jesus demonstrates and embodies perfect love. 1 John 4 tells us God is love, and God becomes flesh to show us what it means to be perfectly loving. The love of Jesus extends to the woman who's caught in adultery, who's about to be murdered by a mob. It extends to the tax collector Zacchaeus, who people hated because of his corruption. It extends to the Samaritans, who the Jews rejected because of their ethnicity. And most of all, it extends to the cross, where he gives his own life so that we can have eternal life. And he rises from the dead so that we too can be raised. To be conformed to the image of Christ means to love the way God loves. The Apostle John records Jesus saying, "My command is this: love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." It doesn't mean just being kind or just behaving in a loving way, but actually being transformed so that our instinct, our first reaction to every person we meet is to love them perfectly. That's not something we can accomplish on our own. It's something that can only happen as we're conformed to the image of Christ. That kind of love is inconvenient. That kind of love is going to cost us time and money and maybe even some relationships. But that's what we're called to do. That's who we're called to be transformed into. So this conforming to the image of Christ happens because we accept an invitation. When we come to Christmas and at the Advent season, when we come to worship our newborn King, that is an invitation to each of us. To behold our King, to behold Christ, not just as a distant God over there somewhere, and not just as a historical event sometime in the past, but as an invitation for us to become like Christ. We're not worshiping a God who's done something kind of generic and general for humanity. We're worshiping a God who has done something specific here and now for each one of us, if we would choose to accept that invitation and become a member of the household of God. So as the worship team comes forward, I invite you to think about this. As we're heading into 2017, maybe you've been considering some resolutions or some goals. I invite you to consider what God's purpose for you is in 2017. And to think about the way that that purpose becomes realized in Jesus Christ. That as we worship Christ, as we come see what God has done, we see that God has made it possible for us to be transformed. And all we have to do is accept that invitation, accept that offer, receive that gift of being conformed to the image of Christ.